As we've mentioned, the political and economic crisis in Venezuela has also sparked one of the world's largest humanitarian crises. Carrying what they can, cradling their precious children, an estimated 3 million Venezuelans have fled their country, making their way into neighboring countries, where they must be fed and housed and cared for. For more on that, I spoke with Fen Hampson. He's Executive Director of the World Refugee Council and Director of the Global Security and Politics Program at the Centre for International Governance and Innovation in Waterloo, Ontario. He joined me in the studio. First, from a practical point of view, what could Canada and the other members of the Lima Group do to help deal with the humanitarian and refugee crisis that's been spawned by Venezuela?
Well, there's certainly a lot more that can be done. The countries that are neighbors of Venezuela have experienced, particularly in the case of Colombia, millions of people coming across the border. These are people in very dire circumstances, some of them. And I think there is a real need to, first of all, call a donors conference. It's not going to happen through the UN because the UN Security Council is deadlocked on this issue, but there's nothing to stop Canada, other key countries from saying, we've got a major refugee crisis here, or forcibly displaced persons, and it's time to not only start opening our wallets, but mobilizing some new instruments to help refugee hosting states in the region.
I know you've got some ideas about new instruments. Tell me what you're talking about.
Well, first of all, the Inter-American Development Bank can complement some of the efforts that the World Bank is playing in terms of issuing, for example, refugee bonds. Those bonds could also be issued by some of the refugee hosting states like Colombia, for example. But it's probably better to do it through an international instrument. One of the other things we can do is to seize the assets of Maduro and his henchmen that are sitting in bank accounts in the United States, elsewhere.
I know, for example...
and use those funds, by the way, to repurpose them to help refugees. And we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars.
Right, because I know Canada, along with other nations, has imposed sanctions and frozen the assets of some Venezuelans who they believe are complicit in the situation. But you think there needs to be more done with that money?
Well, right now the money just sits frozen in a bank account somewhere. And it can't be used for anything. It can't even be used to be reinvested, obviously. Our proposal through the World Refugee Council is to take that money through a court-ordered process to literally seize it and to channel it through some of the aid agencies. It could be UN agencies, it could be non-governmental organizations to help refugees.
How realistic is that, do you think, that governments would do that, would take the money and actually...
Well, it's interesting you say that because there's currently legislation that's being developed in the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee. They're quite interested in this idea. And it's a matter of really sort of political will to get the mechanisms in place. And it's not unprecedented because, for example, Switzerland, which has over the years had lots of hot money sitting in bank accounts there, they introduced legislation a number of years ago, either through criminal proceedings or through, a political decision through their administrative laws to take hot money, repurpose it for humanitarian purposes. So it's not unprecedented.
What do you think we should expect to see coming out of this Lima Group meeting here in Canada?
Well, the meeting was called by Canada, and Canada has been playing, I would say, an important role in terms of holding the ring for discussions. First of all, the meeting that took place not so long ago to recognize the opposition, to get the countries in the region to say, we're going to, most of them, to recognize Guaido as the legitimate president of Venezuela. I think this meeting is important because there's a real risk of an escalation of violence. Maduro has created a new sort of police force. They are rounding up opposition members, protesters. In some cases, those individuals have been executed by this secret police force. And there's a real risk that Maduro may feel he's got his back to the wall, and the only way he's going to be able to deal with this crisis is to either incarcerate Guaido and his group, or perhaps even worse. So I think, you know, the Lima meeting is an opportunity for member states in the region, neighbors, to say, don't go there. It's also an opportunity to start looking at potential diplomatic solutions to this crisis. And unfortunately, we're in a situation where negotiation is a bad word, because efforts to negotiate with Maduro before, he's used it to buy time, to in effect shore up his political position.
Just one final thought. Do you think the Lima Group can really have influence here? As you point out, Maduro has been deaf to any kind of sort of outside conversation in any situation before. What kind of impact do you think they can actually have?
Well, I think, to be realistic, the kingmakers here are the United States. It has the most levers because it's been buying roughly 40% of Venezuela's oil exports. It has taken a decision very recently. The president took a decision to say, we'll take the oil, but you're not going to get the money. It's going to be repurposed through Citgo, the American oil company that is refining Venezuelan oil, taking those funds and making them available to the opposition in Venezuela. So the government can't get its hands on those revenues. And that clearly is going to affect the economic situation in Venezuela in the short term.
I was going to say perhaps even deepen the humanitarian crisis.
And it may deepen the humanitarian crisis. I think there's a lot of concern about that. But to come back to your question about what can the Lima Group do? First of all, I think a strong statement about the importance of sending I would say, a strong message to Maduro and his henchmen that don't do anything to the opposition. Mm-hmm. Be careful if you're planning to use force, because you're going to pay for it. I think it's also important to certainly send, and obviously working with Venezuela's neighbors, to ensure that those who want to cross the border are able to do that in a safe fashion. I think also looking at where we're going to go with if there is regime change, because the humanitarian problem is not going to disappear. And so I think getting organized for the rebuilding of Venezuela, as we talked about, also looking at the needs of refugee hosting countries in the region, which are substantial, and not to mention the needs of refugees themselves, that mm-hmm. donor conference. So I think there's a lot that can be done, and it's going to take, obviously, effective, quiet leadership by countries like Canada, working with Colombia, working with Brazil, to keep carrying the ball forward on this.
Thank you very much for your insight on this.
My pleasure.